Welcome, everyone, to the Kindly Apps Talk Show, a show about technology and helping people work together. We do this live every Monday and Friday at 12 p.m. Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern. If you're new to the show, welcome. It's awesome to have you, awesome to see you. And if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to use the question and answer box, and where you can actually vote up the questions that you really want to have answered live on the show. So don't be afraid to submit it. We'd love to hear all questions from all experience levels. It helps to provide context to what we're talking about. And context is also something that we'll enjoy today in our topic. Talking about passwords, usernames, they're everywhere. Maybe we used to write them down on the back of our hand, or maybe we keep them in a secured location. But what is the safest option for people who are building a website? They need to authenticate or registrate users, and also for us using passwords. What's really the best way to do it? So I'd like to turn our attention over to Brandon. He has been instead of using maybe a notebook or maybe a sticky note, what do you use to kind of keep all of the passwords that you have for various websites and services that you use organized and accessible?
Well, I've been telling my wife all my passwords, and then I will ask her. No, just kidding. So you guys actually turned me on to something called LastPass, and it is amazing. It will allow you to store all your passwords in a vault. It will categorize them and organize them. It accepts one master password. So that's the only one you really need to remember. Don't forget that one. I've done it. And then yeah, don't do that. So anyway, one master password will get you into your vault. And then from there, you can access like every password for whatever you have. And I have a Chrome extension installed, which will also do autofills for you, different authentications. Yeah. So I'm still learning it. You guys turned me on to it. It's awesome, though. It does a lot of cool things.
And how is that? I mean, that actually, let's go ahead, Kevin. I have a question.
I was going to ask the question of why do we even have to have a password just for me to be on your website?
That's actually a really good question. I think that Chris has a good answer to that. Go ahead, Chris.
That's a great question. And you don't. And it's better if you don't have a password.
I hate it. I'm so sick of new passwords for everything. It makes me not want to sign up for stuff.
I know, right? And you have to increment the number at the end of your password by one. Ugh.
It's like
Or think of an entirely separate email address to send it to.
it's like if airplanes had like a different password for every airplane that you had to get onto, right? Like every single site that you go to on the internet, it seems like wants you to sign up for something and provide a different password and username. And so it's just impossible to manage. I have hundreds and hundreds saved in LastPass. Before I started using LastPass, like I had them, like I just used the same one over and over again. But that started to be a really bad idea because one gets broken into and then they have your password for all the sites. So yeah, using one of those password managers is the only way to manage it. It's really hard sometimes to talk people into using one because they're like, oh, I have to learn this new thing. And like, can't I just remember my password? Especially if they're at that point of like, okay, I'm still using one password to sign into everything. And it's like my granddaughter's name. But it feels like it's more work. But once you get it running, it's so much less work. I was actually really glad to see, like, I've used LastPass for years, but in the last year or two, the phones have started having password managers built right into it. So I know on the iPhones now, I've helped some people and it just built right into Safari. It will create a password for you for a site and it will remember it for you. And so it's even one step easier than LastPass.
And as far as authentication too, I know it maybe uses your face or your thumbprint to unlock that. So it's a little bit more secure and a little bit more user-friendly. I just use my MySpace password. I've just used that in perpetuity. So maybe I'm one of those people, Elliot.
It's possible. If passwords are really keys. right? And if you go like all the way back to like having keys for buildings or cars, you can imagine if like you had to have a separate key that you carried with you for every room you went into in your house versus just like a small number of keys. Most of us have had multiple keys, but if you can imagine trying to carry around 200 keys, like that's just more than any of us can deal with, even without trying to remember it, right? Or we were just trying to find the right one to use on that door.
Yeah, Brandon?
Yeah, I wanted to say too that since I started using LastPass, it's actually encouraged me to use stronger passwords because we've all had that where you're logging in, or I mean, where you're signing up and it suggests a password and you're like, I'm not using that. There's no way I'll remember that. I don't want to write all that crap and I don't want to type it in either. Like all the funky little different symbols. No, I'm good. But LastPass will recommend it and you can say, oh yeah, that's really long. No one's going to crack that. Hopefully I'll put it in and it'll save it and autofill it, right? So that has helped me because I never would use that stuff before. I would always use something simple, like Elliot said, your granddaughter's last name. And yeah, and people figure that stuff out. Like that's their job. They're evil people and they figure it out. And going back to the days where we would all be on AIM and as teenagers, I had a friend who sat there and cracked like 15 of our passwords just by going through and typing things that he knew about us and like boom got and he stole our accounts as a prank. But you know, if someone you know can do that with like minimal effort, someone who does it for a, like living, I guess you could say, can do it. So yeah, there's reasons to use secure passwords, and then there are also reasons why passwords are an annoyance.
And there's been an evolution to that, right? Like before, it's like it was used to maybe you had a password and then you had security questions. Every time you log in, you have to have security questions. What's kind of the standard now? Like what is, what's a good standard now, especially if you're just starting, maybe making a little website so people can access your awesome photos or something like that? Elliot?
So one step better is especially if you're responsible for the software, you're working at a company, you're working at a startup, you're building new things. If you're somebody working on building new things, you got to really ask yourself, like, do we need to have a list of passwords in our application, like in our database that we're creating? And the answer, like 100% of the time, or almost 100% of the time, should be no, right? Like I can't tell you how many times I've gone to do an audit and look at some application code and I see that they have passwords in plain text in their database and nobody's encrypting the backups of that database, and anybody at the company can go get the list of all the usernames and passwords out of there. So what's one step better than that is something called single sign-on, or SSO. And so anybody who's making applications or deploying applications at a company or on the internet should be trying to use single sign-on, which is where you have your account with somebody, and then that site can check your ID. So think about, like I mentioned, getting on the airplane. When you are at the airport and you're going to get on the airplane, you don't give them a username and password just for that airplane and a credential just for that airplane. You show them a government issued credential. And they trust that in order for you to get that government issued credential, you had to like go through an identity check and like it's a good enough verification. So they look at that and they double check to see that it seems real. It's not perfect, but it's a check. And then they let you through because you have authenticated as a person, and you are on their list of who are the people that should be allowed on the plane. And so it's the same thing with a website or an application. I don't want to make a new username and password that's just for like the dog wash place down the road, but I do want to make an appointment to go wash the dog. And so I want to be able to use my Google credentials. And they'll know, yes, you're really Elliot, and you're allowed to make a reservation. And when you get here, if you need to adjust anything on your account or put in a payment information or cancel your appointment, if you want to do any of those things where we need to make sure you're really you, then you're just going to authenticate with your Google password. It doesn't mean they have access to my password, but it means that they're using that central system for confirming that I am a person with an identity, and I should be allowed to modify any of the data that's associated with my account. So they have an account for me, but they don't have a password for me.
Oh, that makes a ton of sense. And so where is the next step in that? Like, where can you, like if you are a small business deploying something or building something new, where would you want to start in that process?
So
Elliot?
you kind of got to look at what else exists in your world, right? Are you building a brand new system and you're a small startup, or are you trying to deploy some software inside a bigger company? So a lot of the clients that we work with are bigger companies, and they will already have established at like the enterprise level, at the company level, an identity system. It might be Active Directory. They might be using Google Apps. They might be using one of the bigger sort of industrial grade identity providers like Okta or Ping Identity. So you want to, as much as possible, try and figure out how you bridge your custom systems with some definitive list of identities. Because what that allows you to do is you want to separate out, like, you don't want to have people have to have so many passwords they have to manage. There's been like companies I worked at where I had 50 passwords just inside the one company for accessing different systems inside that company. And of course, you use a password manager to manage them, but it's way better to just have one password that, like, this is my employee account at this company. And then any of those 50 systems at the company can check and see, like, oh, is Elliot allowed to access this system? Yes. Here's the permissions that Elliot has in the payroll system. I should be able to edit my own contact information. Or in the project management system, I should be able to like do lots more things. And they can kind of assign appropriate permissions, but you don't want to have to like go change your password in every single one of those systems.
Brandon?
Yeah, so I have a question. What if I have 10 different logins, and I've decided that I want to use single sign-on with all of them so that I just log in with my Google account. But let's say somebody gets access to my Google account. Now they have access to all 10 of my logins, rather than if each one of those had a different password. Then if they guess one password, at least they don't have the other 9. So where is like this? Where's the? Yeah, go ahead. You get what I'm getting at.
Sure, Kevin.
Yeah, so now you're talking about, well, I mean, there's a couple ways you can talk about this, but specifically something you can use with your Google authentication, if you have used that in multiple places, is multi-factor authentication on top of just the password you have. So what you're doing there is you're making it that you have to have 2 things to get into that account, more keys, naturally, but one of them is kind of a time-sensitive key. And so if you don't have access to the generator for that key, then while they might have your password, they can't actually fully authorize a new computer to get into your system. And there's varying levels of that, but I don't know if you've ever run into this where you do try to log into a new device, then Google wants extra login from you. And so that's what it's doing. It's multiple authorizations that it's getting to build up to one total authorization. And so there's a bunch of ways you can do it with physical key devices. You can do it with getting text messages, with getting phone calls. It's really up to you how you implement it. But Google specifically supports at least 3 different ways of getting those, I think.
And what are some, we'll have Elliot and then Chris.
Oh, go ahead, Chris. I'm trying to zoom in on one of these keys to show.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say that if an organization does want to use SSO, they should use multi-factor authentication for sure on that main account, right? Just because of the issues that you brought up, Brandon. And that'll protect it to an extent too, right? MFA is not perfect either.
No, it's really
sure is better than nothing.
Yeah, and so I've got here. Here is a Google key, or this is from a manufacturer called YubiKey. It works with Google. I've got 2 of these keys, and so these are little secure key storage computers. These are actually like very difficult to hack. And so I have these associated with my Google account. And then I use And I also have them associated with like my GitHub account and like anything important that I'm going to access. And so as much as possible, I want to use those accounts, those credentials to access any important systems, because the amount of investment that has been made in protecting and strengthening those logins is millions and probably even billions of dollars higher than any of those other sites that I'm accessing. And so you're right that, Brandon, that like a lot more is riding on that one Google account, but also there's a lot more protections in place. And so that's like another good argument, right? It's like, well, that you can put much more effort into protecting one account and then use those credentials in multiple places.
And how would you use that key, Elliot? Like, I haven't seen one of those. I've heard of them, but I haven't seen how they actually can be used.
Yeah, so this is a USB. This is just a USB plug right here. And so when I need to log into my computer, it doesn't prompt me every day, but if I'm at a different location, it'll probably prompt me. Or if it's been a few days, it'll prompt me. And so then I plug this into the computer, and it says, go ahead and press the button. I press the button, and that is a little secure computing encryption thing, and it like provides my key to unlock my account. And I need that in addition to my password.
I see. Kevin?
And Google and a few other single sign-on providers have also enhanced that just through other hardware devices too. So now you can create a key on your phone, for example, and your phone becomes an actual hardware key. And so that's one of the things. And you can have a couple different layers of these. So like, I don't recommend only having one of these multi-factor things configured. You should have a few of them as kind of like a tiered backup strategy. Like if I lose that, then this is how I would get it. And then if I lose that, I would get it like this. Obviously, there's a point where it has to be a real key or it isn't doing anything. But yeah, there's definitely a lot to look in there. But I was really impressed with when you can get it to work. Some apps it's more clunky than others, but using my phone as the hardware device key for those accounts as part of that multi-factor authentication with Google single sign-on. Again, there's many other providers out there, and Apple approaches it differently. They're using like a different email address as part of what they're giving you to single sign-on. So you're not giving that risk that Brandon was talking about. So it really does depend on the provider too.
Or you're spreading that risk out.
Apple's the other big one, right? Besides Google, that's doing a great job of this. And so your Apple ID is really, really heavily protected. And so any sites that you go to, if there's an option for sign in with Google or sign in with Apple ID, you want to be using those rather than creating a password just for that site as much as possible.
Is there a use case for having a site and not using SSO, but just making someone create a username and a password?
If you have the investment where you're going to be competing with Amazon, Apple, or Google, then you should absolutely be doing that. So maybe if you're in one of the top 10 governments in the world, you could make a case for having your own username database. But if you're not in that case, you should not be doing it.
That's fair. So there's already a kind of a set of an infrastructure in place, and to be able to build on top of that. So how do I do that then? If I'm going to have a website and I want to have SSO, how can I integrate that? Is there multiple different ways, or is there's kind of like a tried and true method to it? Kevin?
My favorite way to approach it is just go back to the drawing board, reinvent the wheel. You know, why benefit from anything anyone else has figured out before you? Just roll your own thing and hope that the people you hired are as smart as they seem. No, I'm being totally sarcastic. I think
it's so terrible.
Value to contribute.
But it's funny. Like any of the website builders, any of the code kits for creating a new application have like at one button click away, like, oh, let's like here's a login system you can create, and like there's a users table inside this custom database. But you really have to think about like how much money am I going to spend and how many engineers am I going to have on payroll protecting and safeguarding this database of passwords? Or should I do the extra step of like going and using a username service or credential service? You should totally do that. But even before that, you should ask yourself, like, why am I writing custom code for an application at all. Maybe you can use one of the no-code solutions that's out there, and there's a ton of interesting stuff there.
Yeah, there are a lot of no-code solutions that let you do many things beyond authorization, but like Glide is one that has an authorization system in it that you can use because it's using Google Sheets as a backend database. So glideapps.com. They have a couple different things on the pro tier that you can manage. You could have something really simple where you just have a few email addresses, and it's not actually where you're managing a password for someone. It's sending them a special code when they enter their email address, and that confirms that they have control of that email address, and they can log in using that code. So it's like a single-use password. You're kind of just not even bothering to make a whole auth system. But then you can also integrate Google sign-on through their tools as well.
Oh, that's nice. Convenient. So in those solutions, in those like no-code solutions, so you could set that up completely and not have to worry about any kind of database. It's kind of like housed in-house, so to speak.
Well, those providers are giving you a little database. I think Brandon set up one with Glide that was for like a roofing company as a little prototype. But you really have to ask yourself, like, what's the purpose of this information? Why do I need to know who these users are? Maybe it's like to fight fraud and spam. And so like that's why we are requiring people to register with Zoom for this live show. Because if we want to be able to, anybody who asks questions, we want to know that like we have an email address or a way to like follow up with them. So it's happened multiple times over the last several weeks that I've been on Zoom calls and people show up and start posting all kinds of things trying to disrupt the meeting. There's no charge to get in, right? Or anybody can get in. But even with that registration step, people have come in and started disrupting the meeting. And so by requiring a registration step, that lets us kick those people out. If we didn't have any registration, if we didn't have any user database, we couldn't kick those people out. Now, in the case of Zoom, we're currently using the webinar feature, and that's a no-code solution. The webinar is our database of users who are allowed to join the webinar.
Wait,
have their email addresses.
You mean we're not harvesting that and selling it to a third party?
Well, that's the other thing, right? It's like sometimes the reason people want registration is because they want to sell info and like they want to sell that list of email addresses or contact numbers to people who are just going to send spam, like unsolicited commercial messages. And so you want to be really clear about why you're collecting that information and what's it going to be used for. And so the gold standard is like you only ever ask a user to create an account or to sign in or to do something like that when there actually is a payoff, when there's actually a reason that's driving it. Until that point, you don't ask for it. And so you can watch the show on YouTube without creating any new accounts. But if you want to ask a question in the live show, then you need to get a Zoom registration currently for the webinar. We want to get rid of that. Well, I think we'll talk about that in a little bit. We're trying to come up with a way where we don't have to have you give your information to Zoom. You're wanting to participate in our show, not in a Zoom show. And so wouldn't it be nice if you could just like register with us and then we could make promises to you about the only thing, what we are or are not going to do with your contact info.
Yeah, that's interesting. So currently there is some friction there, right? There's Zoom, there's other no-code solutions like Glide, like Kevin was mentioning, and a lot of other options to manage user registration, who's accessing your website, your service. But what are how are we going to use that, or in particular you mentioned with the show, how are we trying to use that and why are we trying to use that? And maybe Chris, you can start.
Yeah, so I guess I can get into like the how. So we're kind of I'm kind of writing a proof of concept right now using Gatsby and React that also uses AWS Amplify, which provisions basically everything that needs to be provisioned in the backend, including a Cognito user pool. So AWS Cognito will handle all your authorization for you, right? But you can configure it to use like a different identity provider, such as Google or Apple or Facebook
Or
and so,
MySpace.
or MySpace. Yeah, sure. I don't think so, but okay. But yeah, it makes it a lot easier to use Cognito whenever you're doing something. Maybe you're trying to get an MVP up, right? That helps you get it up pretty quick. I think I got like a really minimal usage of Cognito with multiple pages in like a day or two.
And what data points are you requiring?
As far as like what the user needs to provide for us.
Yeah.
Right now, just in this like proof of concept that I'm working on, it's just email address. And that's the only information that we get back, I believe. So we don't maintain any passwords or anything. You can sign up with an email currently right now, but maybe we won't do that when we actually deploy it. I'm not sure yet, but you can actually set up between your connection between your identity provider and the Cognito application what you want to pull in, and then you can map those attributes. So you can pull in various things like username, location, if you wanted to. But like Elliot was saying, if you don't need to, it's best not to take that user information, right? Because we don't need it. So why would we need to pull that into our system? So yeah.
Yeah, and if you're a food delivery service, it really makes a lot of sense to ask for somebody's location.
Exactly.
Or if you're providing anything that has anything to do with location, right? Like if you're a home inspection service, any of those things. Of course, for all of those services, you got to take into account that people might be traveling, and so like their primary address might not be where they are trying to use your service from. But like just stepping even further back than that, like you got to ask yourself, do I need to build a custom app at all? And we thought, well, that's what we do, right? We build custom software. So yes, we need to build a custom app. If we were not a team of software developers, we probably would be looking a lot harder at one of the existing apps, Slido. You could use a Google form to collect questions from people for the show. You could use and those go right into a Google spreadsheet. So there's a bunch of no-code solutions out there, like Zoom webinars is one of those. But then we're trying to explore the other side of this. So having decided, like, yes, we are going to build some custom software, but we're not going to build a custom user database. So then we want to use something off the shelf. So there's a few good options off the shelf. One is called Keycloak. And so Keycloak is open source software. It's sponsored and maintained by Red Hat. And we've built other products that use Keycloak. That actually took several developer years to set up and run. And you have to like run a database and Keycloak servers and do a whole bunch of heavy lifting. So that felt like too much effort. That gives us total control. We were totally managing that database, but we're using an existing software package to manage the user database. And then another option that is like just super easy to use is called Auth0. I have friends that work at Auth0. I think it's a fantastically friendly and well-developed service. It's got really sophisticated security features to protect your users. The thing with Auth0 is it's expensive. And so if you're offering a paid service, it's a fraction of what you would be charging for a subscription fee. So it's really a good deal for everybody involved. But if you are trying to work with a user base who's not paying you anything, right? So we don't charge anybody to be an audience member of the show. So paying, even if it's only pennies, paying per user account for Auth0, the economics don't really make sense for our use case. So then we want to look for another option. Cognito is a managed service from AWS, and that is much cheaper. It's a little bit more work to set up than Auth0, but it's much, much cheaper, and it's actually surprisingly good. It's gotten a lot better than it was in the early days. And so that was the thing we reached for to try out, is like, let's see how far we can get just using Cognito as a managed provider. And we knew that it had really good support for federated identities, right? We want to use logins from Google, logins from Apple. But those are the kind of the three big ones that I would look at first, is like Auth0, totally running your own with Keycloak, or Cognito. if your company doesn't already have one, a bigger company might already have one of the bigger systems that are much more expensive deployed, like Okta or Ping Identity.
So in those examples, those three specifically, is there a scalability issues, or rather, scalability might be an issue or a point that you have to consider. So what would you kind of classify like small, medium, large user base like for each one of those?
But how many lawyers do you have on staff dealing with the requirements from different governments, right? So like those are your scaling points, right? So for us, we're a US-based company. We're primarily concerned for this experiment that we're doing, like with US regulations. And so then the scalability is like, well, you have to pick a region out of the US regions. We can pick East or West, but we're not too worried about scalability. If you are a much larger company, you might have to worry about like, okay, for all of our European customers, we want them in one database. And for all of our US customers, we want them in a different database. And if somebody moves and becomes a citizen of another country, how am I going to handle migrating them? It gets really complicated really quickly. But I would say like organizing by jurisdiction, right? So it's not necessarily just country, but just by jurisdiction, right? Because there's a lot of shared laws in the EU, like GDPR requirements that are common. There's some like Germany is more strict. There's some that are even more country specific, but that's sort of the granularity to look at your user base.
That makes sense. So it's not necessarily like an amount of users that would help you segment or help you use one over the other.
Well, maybe the amount of paying users and the amount of free users, because if you are doing something where you're expecting to have like a larger number of free users whose activity on the system that you're building is subsidized or paid for by the smaller number of users, you want to look at like what your ratios are and what like how many you're converting to paid accounts, how much activity or how much quota. Say you are providing a service like Flickr, where you let people upload photos. Like if you're going to have a free plan, you want to make sure you're thinking about like, okay, how much am I going to spend supporting the free plans versus how much am I going to spend supporting the paid plans, just to make sure the economics of everything all work out.
That makes sense. Very nice. So, Brandon?
No, I'm going to kind of steer it away. So if you don't want to do that yet, like,
go for it.
I have this thought came to my head. As a user, if I go to a website and I want to log in, and it's asking for single sign-on, let's say through Google, what is laid out there that can assure me that like this is legit and that it's not something someone built and I think it's single sign-on and I'm going to go ahead and enter in my Google email address and password, and now boom, that wasn't what I thought it was, and someone has my information. Like, are there things in place or something that I can visually see, like, yeah, besides the key, that I can see and say, okay, yeah, this is really legit. This is Google and not like something that someone has built to look like it?
No.
Yeah, visually, it's pretty hard. There's some really sneaky stuff, right?
Crimes are hard because it's crime, but yeah, it's definitely something to be aware of. You can get tricked,
and you should seriously get a key, right, and connect a hardware key to your Google account, or multi-factor, right, where it's like anytime you try and do a Google login, it's going to send you the text message, or any of those additional layers of authentication. Exactly what they stop is like people tricking you into signing into something that wasn't really the site. You might still get tricked into typing your password in, but the more protections you can put on that main identity, the safer you're going to be from getting tricked into something.
Kevin?
Yeah, and just to add on that, what you're doing when you use those sign-on systems is you're saying, instead of trusting this website that I don't trust yet with some information, I'm telling someone I do trust, Google or Apple or whoever, they're allowed to tell them that it's me, right? So they're allowed to tell this website you're trying to get access to that it's you. You're basically saying, ask my friend if you don't believe it's me. And so they're going there and saying, hey, is this person? And then you're confirming with Google, yeah, I want you to authorize this person to know who I am or this site to know who I am. However, that does nothing to ensure that that site has a non-malicious intent towards you as a user. So separate from whether or not you are giving away access to your Google thing, there's the whole layer of being sure that what you're doing on websites makes sense. So if you authorize with Google into some website that is masquerading as your bank, they can set that up to look real as far as the Google authorization and to work effectively, but they are a fake bank. Google tries really hard to not let people use their system like that, but there's ways that people can masquerade. And so if you were to give in a chat on that webpage, then your password away, you're in the same exact situation again. So you do have to be savvy and smart if you're going to be doing stuff on the internet, and not just assume that it's safe. It's way more dangerous than going to a store and buying something from a clerk.
And is that how?
Which is normal, and it has been, and I'm not trying to scare anybody. It's just, you just didn't realize it yet. Now we're talking about passwords, and we realize, like, oh my goodness, there's no locks on anything. It's like, yeah, there hasn't been, but they're getting slightly better.
Oh, I've noticed that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, yeah, fraud is a real thing. Like that seems like something we should talk about. Not today, but
we got a fraud show coming up for sure.
Oh, sweet, awesome.
You know, that's totally, because I mean I know that credit monitoring services, or actually really even credit cards services, financial institutions, they've gotten a little bit more savvy, and they've been sending alerts like, oh yeah, your email was found on the dark web or something like that, and then that's how that stuff can happen, right? Kevin?
Yeah, if you want some insight into the kind of plots that work with people occasionally, at least the kind of plots where people are answering the phone and like talking people through giving away information, if you look up scam baiting on YouTube, there's people that live stream like pretending to have been tricked by a scammer. So there's a real scammer, there's a real phishing email or something that they've been sent, and they'll record themselves talking to the scammer and going through the steps, but then kind of like exiting the workflow every now and then and messing it up. So like, there's all these little things they do, which I think you could go down a rabbit hole there, but it is very insightful to see like, oh, this is the kind of pressure that like my grandmother might be under from a phone call that's telling her like, you're breaking everything if you don't just do what I say. And it's very rudimentary, but I was shocked at how like it is all about social pressure and stuff. So like, especially to stay off the phone with people and your passwords.
So much about social pressure. I help out different security teams, and we see these scams come through all the time where it's like someone got into somebody's email and sends an email to a different employee at the company, whether they actually got into the email or not, and are very demanding. Like, I need you to do X, Y, Z. Call me at this number to confirm, but in the next 15 minutes. And that's social. We're so tuned to be like, oh, I better help do a good job. Somebody needs me. That fraud show is going to be really interesting, talking about how much time gets wasted and how expensive it is fighting these people who are really good at pressuring you.
And how just like a few simple questions do reveal whether or not somebody's being an actual, customer service representative, or has something wrong with him that day, or is even worse, is trying to scam you. But like being shouted at by anybody that is supposed to be helping you is like a clear sign that they're not sure what their job is.
Oh man. And with that, the goal, I guess, or what a lot of people have harvested is obviously like email or email addresses. So to tighten up on that, would you suggest, I mean, we have the two-factor or the multiple factor authentication. That's the word, multi-factor authentication. But would you suggest anything else? I mean, not to go too far deep down into the fraud level, but as far as using that, single sign-on for something, would you even suggest like, hey, I'm going to have multiple Google sign-ons? Kevin?
I do try to keep work things separate from personal things. When you own your own business, that can get complicated, but it's not actually that complicated if you just think about it a little bit. So if you have a Gmail account, you can segment things inside of Gmail by adding a plus sign and then other text after it to the beginning of your email address. So like, say your email was like coolstuff@gmail.com. If you added cool stuff plus junkmail@gmail.com and then signed up at all of your kind of like whatever websites with that, you could create a filter in your Gmail to never see any of the communication from any of those emails. Now, you don't want to do that before you get like an authorization or something like that to confirm your account, but that can cut down on the amount of spam you see or in like the stuff that people have to sell to you. But I mean, the email's still coming into your inbox,
Chris?
This might be a little bit off topic too, but I like doing that because it's a way to, if you add a mnemonic with like the plus sign, whenever, if you have to use an email to sign up for something, you can see who's leaking your email or selling it. Because if you say you sign up for, XYZ website and you put that in your email address, and then some other company sends an email to the XYZ email that you provided, and you say, aha, you said you weren't going to sell my information, but there it is. Because they generally don't scrape off those types of things. And besides doing that, another good thing is to use something like Gorilla Mail maybe for like these like one-time signups that will probably get spam. That's something that's good. It's just like a one-time use email system.
But I just wanted
Yeah, so
10% off, right? Like, is that the
So Chris,
Elliot?
Chris is talking about Gorilla Mail. Here's another one, Spam Gourmet. There's a bunch of these. So these give you throwaway email addresses. So then the question you have to ask yourself is like, do I trust my password or whatever to be, whatever I'm doing with this email address, if I'm registering for an account, do I trust this site to actually have that information that's going to be sent? But it's this constant battle between people who are being shady and people who are trying to conduct legitimate business. And so that's why we're trying so hard to educate people about good practices for when they're signing into things, but especially software developers and like any software that we build as an example for people to be really responsible with people's credentials. And we don't want to have any data that we don't need because it's just a lot of stress to worry about protecting that data. And if you didn't need it in the first place, why are you taking on that extra stress?
And at that point, it's also like a liability issue. If something does leak and hey, it gets known by someone, it gets retweeted 1,000 times, and your business is effectively taken under. Kevin?
Yeah, if you're part of a small team inside of a company that is making some customized software too, it can be a real challenge to evaluate everything at a higher level of viewpoint because you may not have that experience. But thinking through all that stuff and deciding to sideline that responsibility or to push that responsibility to be like a rock solid authorization provider off to one of these single sign-on providers is really good for your company's brand long term, probably because it's going to be Google or Apple who have the brand damage from the breach instead of just you from your own decisions. And I think that sort of stuff doesn't get talked about enough, that it's not a question of whether or not your company is going to have a data leak. It's a question of how many months are between now and then when your name as a company is in the news for having found your database of users. It's just a matter of time.
And did people think when that happens, oh, they did a pretty good job? Like, I can see how that still happened. That's a shame. Or are they going to be like, how arrogant were these people? Why didn't they use one of the better solutions that is actually cheaper?
Oh, that's great. And then we talked about Chris. He's mentioned he is using AWS Cognito for this. We mentioned some of the other ones that you can use, or applications you can use. But what if I just have like a little, perhaps a newsletter, and I just want people's emails, and I want them to be able to have exclusive access to this. We talked about a lot of no-code solutions, but would there be any case where I just want to never have to deal with this, put it off completely? What would you suggest for somebody just wants to have something to put out to people that they can access? Kevin?
Yeah, there's a couple different email list providers out there. So I think everyone's heard of MailChimp, at least from podcast commercials. But those are not giving, those are not capturing passwords for people. They're just kind of giving you an email address and giving you permission to send emails to them. But on the side of an actual authorized user system, there's a website called makerpad.co. And here, I'll put a link to it in the chat. But they have a lot of no-code membership providers listed there. I think they make, they try to sell classes on how to use these different pieces together to make something cohesive. But all of those things listed there have some version of like a less code or a no-code membership profile that can be used, or membership system rather.
Nice. So there's multiple levels. If you're on that level where you're like, this is not for business necessarily, or it's maybe for a small business or a new endeavor, just personally, there are levels. There's levels within those too of authorizations.
And one for, you mentioned email lists. A lot of people are doing some really good writing. I've seen this fantastic shift over the last 12 to 18 months from people trying to put writing out as broadly as possible and talking about things like SEO to instead having a slightly closed community, maybe with paid members to a newsletter. Newsletter subscriptions are like this big thing all of a sudden. I'm subscribing to 2 or 3. They're great because I can pay $5 to get really interesting writing from one person that I'm very interested in their work and what they're publishing. And they actually have a viable tiny business. Because there's all of the subscribers. You get 1,000 subscribers and you're talking about money that can support a person. And so one platform that is really neat for that is called Substack. Tons of paid or free email newsletters are being launched on Substack. So it's a great one to check out.
That's awesome. And so kind of looking forward, we have a little bit of time left. Kind of looking forward, where do you think that this is going to go? I mean, we talk about Cognito, we talk about some of the maybe friction that comes with this kind of issue, the liability involved.
Do we have a demo? Can we demo the thing that Chris built last week?
Oh,
unprepared?
Totally unprepared. I don't think I could share screen.
Can you?
I don't think I have a demo.
I think prosthetics are coming next. I think given this medical stuff that's going on, you're going to have identity prosthetics coming out.
Quantum physics. We can quantum lock our bodies to our accounts.
Man, the word quantum just does add weight.
Quantum all the things.
It's more of a speed.
It's just going to be, people aren't going to be crooks anymore. We won't have to have passwords.
So like we talked about single sign-on, but single is a pretty ambitious word in that title. So I don't think we're going to get to, and I'm not advocating for, a single identity database, right? Where like everybody logs into, like they have their UN password and username, and that's what they use to sign into every site across the web. It's useful and good to have like multiple, but I hope we have a lot less than the 200 I have in my LastPass right now. I'm pretty happy having my Apple ID, or I've actually got like a personal Apple ID and a work Apple ID, and then having my Google work and personal IDs. So a handful of strong identities is way better than 200 weak identities.
I was thinking more like 100-character passwords, but that sounds a lot better, actually.
Well, I do think there is something to, we talked about the keys, these YubiKeys. We talked about the phone actually being used as a key. These have some facial recognition stuff in them now. Stronger and stronger identity authentication mechanisms. Like they're taking things into account, like where physically in the world am I actually doing the login from? So I might log into my Google account regularly, but then I take a vacation somewhere and now I'm like logging in from a different country, and it throws up all kinds of warnings and double checks to verify that it really is me. And so I think a lot more of those checks are going to keep coming, and a lot of work is being done to keep them as invisible as possible to us, where we don't even realize those extra checks are all happening. But there is a lot being done to strengthen that initial authentication process.
Until you get to another country and you realize that the only way you can access something is by using your VPN. That's always a bummer.
That is a setting in LastPass. That is a setting in LastPass of like, do I want to allow people, to users, so like I noticed this in our little corporate account. Do we want to allow people to log in from outside the US? And you really have to think hard about those settings. And you want to make sure if somebody does get locked out, that there's a way for them to escalate and like get those things verified. Or if somebody actually does break into that account, that you have a way of like shutting it down.
Oh, that's really good. I think we have a question from Lance. He says, could we get some thoughts on password length versus diversity? Is there one better than the other, or both have to have them? Kevin?
I would definitely double check the exact information on this, but there is some studies or some information that came out around password like phrases as opposed to long strings of characters. And so there's actually way more variability in a language-based password. It's way harder to brute force than just a long character string because of all of the I don't know why exactly, but it's something to do with how many variations of language are accurate versus just the pure number of characters. But so there is something to that. So if you add spaces to that second one, or that first one that was a phrase, if you add spaces in there, I think it does become quite potent compared to just the odd string.
So I've got up classic cartoon from XKCD, which is kind of talking about this question. So there's been guidance for a long time, like in some of the regulatory standards saying you have to have like some funky characters in your password. They have to be hard to type. You need a capital letter, a lowercase letter, a number, a symbol. It has to be a certain length. And so those are almost impossible to remember. And then other passwords are easier to remember. So the example here is like 4 random common words put together: correct, horse, battery, staple. That's a lot easier to remember than a shorter password that has all these funky characters in it. There's no perfect answer to this, but basically you want to have a really long password, even for the one that you remember. And so it really should be a passphrase. It should be a sentence that you can remember. And then for all of the other passwords in your password manager, they should be so long and so complicated that you cannot possibly type them in by hand, that they are not rememberable. And so that's my advice is like everything in your password manager, have the password manager generate it, have it be really hard. The password you use to unlock your password manager or for one of those primary accounts should be a phrase, not a word.
So, password is not a phrase.
And then go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, I got all my strong opinions about this from a movie called Sneakers. If you haven't watched it, oh man, you got to watch it.
Classic.
Too many
Yeah,
secrets.
it's a good one. So you just got to make sure that nobody is using that window, that zoom window through the window, to get your password, get your keystrokes.
You don't want Whistler on the line.
So length is definitely a thing, but what about like if you use a short story? Like what is that good length?
A sentence is probably long enough. So like that's actually a thing that is infuriating to people who are like trying to make the web a more secure place, is how many sites still have size limits on their passwords because they've done something really silly with how they've designed their software. And like there are still sites out there that like won't let you make a password longer than 8 characters. And then they email you the password in plain text as soon as you sign up. And so like those are just examples of even more reasons why you shouldn't trust most places to even have a password with, and you should use a central identity place like your Google ID or your Apple ID.
That makes a ton of sense. Kevin?
I also think it's really important to try in the main areas of your life to get comfortable appearing on camera and having a more in-person type verification with spoken and visual, because that deepfake stuff is coming faster than any of us know. It's probably already deployed in Zoom rooms and you don't know about it, with people doing experiments at least. There's tons and tons of ability to fake images and fake everything. And so you talk about identity and passwords and all that stuff, and it's like there's a whole nother layer of it where just stop believing everything that looks too good to be true. Just stop. Just don't believe it anymore. But don't wonder, is it too? It isn't real. But yeah, there's a lot of that stuff coming. So I think just like taking more ownership of your own identity and pushing that online. People have reasons for not wanting to be known publicly online, and that's fine for them. But for the most part, it's an advantage to have your face on your LinkedIn profile. That's very hard for someone to get in between. But if you're uncomfortable even just like turning on your camera and verifying who you are, it leaves you liable for people who can just kind of operate on that assumption that people are going to just never actually say this is me for real in any way, and just avoid the phone and avoid the call, like whatever. I struggle a lot with social anxiety, and so like it is a real thing where I have to recognize sometimes like I have to talk to this bank about this in order to be safe, because I don't know if they're a bank for real or not, you know?
No, yeah, I had an instance where I was using Amazon in another country. I used my credentials to get in, my Amazon credentials, and then I noticed that before my order was fulfilled, there was basically maybe a day delay, and I noticed that on my LinkedIn profile that someone from the fraud detection department had verified that the picture, the information was there, that I had my current location set to where I was the country I was ordering through Amazon. So yeah, there is, I think on both ends, there's probably that anxiety for like people like Amazon, like big retailers or Walmart or whoever you want to put in there, but like a big retailer side that's providing a service that they are spending, that's part of their services they provide. And then also from the user perspective, as far as, making sure that where you're actually sending your money is who you think it is. Excellent. Well, that's some really good points. I think that it's just a short time here that we have left. So we talked about quite a few things: small to medium business or small to enterprise level business solutions, different ways to do it. If you really want to use a developer or the developers aspect, or also maybe no code solutions if it's something that a project that you're working on personally. And so that's really good. And we have our discussion next week on Mondays. Remember, on Mondays we talk about more technology and developing technology. So next Monday we have actually a really interesting guest. We have Abe Fettig from Film Lab, and he's going to talk about simulating analog technology in a digital world. So that's going to be super exciting. So we look forward to that. And then also, if you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and we'd like to have you. We'd actually like to even have you on the panel if you're up for it. So feel free to join us if you have something that you think that you could be able to share, some insights that you want to share.
What's on Friday?
This Friday, we're actually going to talk about. We invite you to join, obviously Monday and Fridays as well. But we're going to talk about your applicant tracking system. How to enhance your resume to get through applicant tracking systems, and why you even need to do that in the first place. So we're going to have Wes from Ideal Resume with us online for that.
That's going to be awesome.
Yeah, be good. But one point, our show is sponsored by Enlist, which is the only an applicant tracking system that has been specifically designed with the candidate in mind and taking over that candidate experience. So something to mention. But again, join us on Friday at 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. And until then, we'll see you then. Thanks, guys, for being on.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.